Hi, everybody. It's a great day for us to have the talk. So, today's topic is going to be about sex ed and basically just the lack thereof, and how comics can actually be a great medium for educating kids on sex education and other important subjects that parents often don't feel comfortable with. So, I think we should start with some introductions. I'll go first. I'm Sadie, I'm an IDS major and a gender studies minor, and I'm a Libra.
Hi, I'm Risa. I'm a gender studies major and I'm a Cancer.
Hello, I'm Chandy. I'm a history major and I'm a Virgo.
Hey y'all, I'm Anna. I'm a gender studies major and I'm a Gemini.
Hey, I'm Cecilia. I'm a psych major, gender studies minor, and I'm an Aquarius.
I think a really good way to start off this conversation is to really just get familiar with everyone's background in regard to sex ed. Does anyone want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'll go. I think looking back on like the sex ed class that I had in high school, like just trying to go over it, I'm kind of starting to realize that there are so many things that were just never discussed. And over the years, I've come to realize they're actually super crucial to teach kids when they're able to comprehend it. So basically, I went to an extremely conservative rural public school in Michigan. And honestly, it wasn't until I reached college that I realized how there were so many gaps between what I learned and what my other friends learned, like how my education differed from my friend who went to a private school in Thousand Oaks. And honestly, I think this coincides perfectly with like the statistic that I'm showing you, like showing the difference between states and how they're teaching sex ed. And if you look at Michigan, basically they not only stress abstinence teaching, but they also ban abortion conversations. So they do both. And I think disregarding how my own personal research, like through high school, affected my learning, this kind of education that preached abstinence and didn't ever talk about abortion also never discussed that anyone could be anything other than straight, which I think honestly is the main reason why there was so much homophobic language used in my school. Like, I think honestly, it's just making me think about, like, in particular, the comic of a teenage abortion, which I know this didn't really like this kind of goes into like the whole idea of abortion and like teaching about how that goes coincides with sex ed. And I think that thinking about like the role of the man too and how like the burden's always placed on the women, that was kind of something that really stuck out to me. And so I kind of wanted to share that as like a frame that showcased the kind of sex ed that I got in Michigan.
Sadie, I completely feel you. I grew up in Florida, which is an extremely conservative state, and my experience with sexual education in hindsight really seems diminished and, like, to be honest, swept under the rug. Like, my parents, like, honestly, like most families, really relied on the public education system to teach us sex ed. And me and the kids in my class only really learned about it through the context of our reproductive organs, like, getting your period and like how your body's going to like physically change. And the really important information was really kind of left in the dark. Like, I knew nothing about protection. I knew nothing about STDs. Like, I didn't really like I had a concept of what abortion was, but I wasn't really sure like what were all the choices that like I could make if like maybe I got pregnant and I was in that situation. And it really made me feel connected to the comic A Teenage Abortion that we read for class. And it really made me think about what would have happened maybe if the main character like would have been in a society where, sex education wasn't that taboo. And maybe she would have had more awareness about her choices or her options, like birth control, condoms, instead of just abstaining. Because, like, honestly, let's be real, only a small amount of people are going to do that. And since there's a lack of sex education coming from our public schools, it really made me think about how comics can be used as like a really good medium for education. Like this comic, for instance, is so simple in its message, but it's able to really give clarity to the reader, which is something I feel like I didn't get during my sexual education experience.
I completely agree with Risa. I think comics could be a great way to teach about sexual education. And the one I chose here kind of teaches bodily autonomy in like simple terms for both students and parents. Um, and in regards to my personal experience with sexual education, it was very interesting because I got it once in my private Christian middle school, and then by the same lady in my public school, like 6 months later when I went to freshman year of high school. And of course, when I got it in Christian school, it was pretty useless. It was basically just like abstinence until marriage, horror stories of abortion to scare us for like ever having sex before marriage because we get pregnant and have an abortion and die. Like that was literally it. And during all of this, the girls were learning this and the boys were playing soccer outside, like exactly how you'd expect. And then in my public school, it was like a bit more educational, but it was a lot shorter. It was just like to the whole room, boys and girls, taught about different types of birth control, hinted that abstinence is like the most guaranteed way to avoid pregnancy and STDs, and legally not allowed to talk about abortion. And there was no mention of LGBTQ plus sex ed. And it kind of made me realize like if for the conservative Christian type of sex ed, it's genuinely pretty useless and gives terrible preparation. And in the public school form, like it helps a little more, but it's really lacking the importance of teaching consent. There was just nothing about that. And it's such a crucial part of sexual education. And I just think like teaching young people who haven't had those experiences yet is so important because like if that isn't talked about, it's really damaging for young people because like unfortunately many people will have like a situation in their life where someone tries to push them outside of their comfort zone and like no proper preparation or like warning signs of these manipulation tactics, like all they can do is like use the knowledge of how to protect from pregnancy and STDs instead of how to protect their own bodily autonomy from like self-serving partners or what have you. Um, and I found this quote. It's from Jennifer Driver, and she's a state policy director at the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States. And she basically, just in terms of talking about consent, was saying if, quote, if administered properly, sex education that's comprehensive has a unique power to really create a culture shift in this country, end quote. And I thought that that was very true. Like teaching more about consent could really change kind of the sexual assault culture that is so normalized in America.
Yeah, Chandy, I can relate to you so much in the part that you were talking about abstinence until marriage being pushed onto you, because it was also being pushed onto me by not only church members, but also my parents as well, which made my experience with sexual education very, very simple in that it was non-existent until I was in middle school. Also, keep in mind that where I grew up, sex was kind of like a trend, and that it was kind of cool for people to have sex because then they were seen as like cool kids, popular. My school did have a class for sexual education, and because I knew that I wouldn't learn about it at home, I actually forged my parents' signatures so that I could participate in the sexual education class. I am also not condoning forging your parents' signatures. I did it in the name of education. Um, I don't feel bad, but like I said, desperate times call for desperate measures for me. And so after learning about sex and how to use protection, I realized that some of my classmates already experienced their first times. However, it wasn't the normal first time experience, quote unquote, where like, there's fireworks and love is in the air. Because I actually learned that the, oh my, I actually learned that consent is a really important factor in it, and a lot of my classmates' first times did not consist of consent. They also didn't teach us about sexual abuse, and I didn't realize how important it was to learn until it was too late. My sexual education class also failed to take into consideration cultural practices or norms, because as a Pacific Islander female, I'm not allowed to talk about anything dealing with sex in my household unless I were to do it in secret with my sisters, and they were kind of my way of like getting a real feel of how sex is supposed to go and what you're supposed to do. And for some odd reason, my parents always thought that every time someone was to have sex, they would get pregnant. And they would like just ignore the fact that there's contraceptions such as like Plan B and condoms out there. And so my cultural norms collided with what I was taught in school, and it confused me as I got older. And so the comic that I chose kind of relates to my experiences with my older sister because my family would always hype her up when it comes to like the things being shown in this comic. But as soon as she got pregnant, my parents would cry and be like, where did we go wrong? And I'm just thinking in my head that a simple conversation could have changed that whole situation.
Yeah, Anna, I definitely agree with you. I think for a lot of us, there was no type of sex talk at home, and the sex talk we received at school still wasn't enough. For me, I grew up in LA, which is super progressive, but the sex ed that I received still didn't seem adequate. I remember in 5th grade, that's the first time we had any type of talk about sex or puberty. And for the girls, it was mostly only about puberty. We only talked about getting our periods, and then there was talk about staying abstinent. And then when I had gone up to a few of my classmates who were boys, they were telling us that they were talking about condoms, and they actually had a little more comprehensive sex ed. So it almost seemed like the girls were advised to refrain from sex, but the boys were almost encouraged to have it. And then I remember a few years later, when I was a freshman in high school, that was actually a more comprehensive sex ed. Planned Parenthood did come in. They did talk about like STDs, birth control, condoms, all of that. But there was no talk about consent, about sexual identity, and really all of that seemed super heteronormative, especially in LA and really everywhere. Like people should have talk about, like the LGBTQ plus community should be involved in that conversation. And it really didn't seem like they were because everything was super heteronormative. So then the comic that I ended up choosing was this cute one. It talks about people's boundaries. And I think that's really important because everyone's boundaries are different. So you have to really respect everyone else's, and you can't reciprocate the same ones on people.
Yeah, I feel like I totally agree with that, especially like I feel like what you have said and honestly what all of us have said has really made me sort of question the method in which sex ed is taught. 'Cause I know like you talked about like how Planned Parenthood came in when you were in high school, but like it still wasn't enough, right? And like all I feel like that's just such a common theme between all of our stories and that like the method that is being taught isn't enough, and it doesn't teach everything consistently, it doesn't give every facet of what we know to be sexual education as, so, like, why doesn't it do that? And honestly, like, this is kinda making me think about, like, the gender norms too, and thinking about how at least I know in public schools or, like, public rural schools that are in my area that health class and the sex education unit is taught by a gym teacher or someone who's meant to teach, like, both gym and health class. So thinking about that makes me wonder, like, where along the line in, US history was it decided that it was a gym teacher's job? And not only that, but why was it the job of anyone who's not a medical professional in some capacity to teach students about the importance of sexual health? Like, I know in particular, like Planned Parenthood, I mean, that's like a great source to have, especially coming to talk about sex education. But like the method also still needs to be altered to address everything, like an LGBTQ plus mindset of like straight isn't like the normality. We live in such a heteronormative society that like that needs to be addressed also. And I think too that there's a lot to be learned from other sources of media. And I think because of social media and other online sources that I was, and I know you probably all were, I was able to sort of form my own thoughts on sex ed and fill in those gaps that I missed. But along with that, like if we're looking at why this disparity between education is taught between these demographics, like public versus private or conservative versus progressive communities, that disparity and like that difference between demographics still exists. And I think that's also something that should be talked about.
Sadie, you bring up a really important issue. I recently saw that last year, LAUSD was trying to create a more inclusive, like sexual education program, and some parents were so outraged. Like they're very conservative, obviously, but like the outrage was unreal. Like they were like, this isn't age appropriate, like blah, 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 like XYZ. And I honestly just find it insane that we actually see schools pushing for better sex education, and then there's like this backlash coming from parents. So it's like, it's just these polarizing things. And with that being said, like honestly today I feel like the comics we provided can help aid that frustration that kids feel when their education is being compromised because of personal beliefs. And with that being said, everyone, I'm really glad that we were able to explore these topics together, and I want to thank everyone for sharing and being vulnerable and coming in today with their experience.
Yeah.
Yes, this is so good. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. It was really, this is like such an important topic to talk about. So I'm really glad that we're able to talk about it in such like a free setting.
Yes.
All right, guys, thank you so much for coming to our podcast today.
Uh-oh.
Bye.
Oh, that was nerve-wracking.
All right, I feel like we can stop the recording, and I'll just if you can send me the recording, or if you know how to clip out the last like second.
That was good though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm honestly, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I'm fine with that too.
How do I